Cord,
Yeah. Okay.
and I will spotlight you.
Okay. I've been reading John Pettit's translation and introduction to Mipham's Beacon of Certainty. So I guess besides the Douglas Duckworth book that I was teaching from the last 3 weeks, this would be a text that I would strongly recommend. I was reading an article by Thupten Jimba this week, and in it he recommended chapters 6 and 7 of Pettit's introduction to his translation of Mipham's Beacon of Certainty, because in these chapters, Pettit does a kind of thoroughgoing comparison, comparing and contrasting, but I would say a little bit more on the contrasting between Mipham's thought and Tsongkhapa's thought.
Okay.
Oh, and Richard put
Yes.
the link to that book in the chat. Yeah, that was actually maybe one of the first texts that I read by Mipham. I read that one in English initially in Pettit's translation. It's quite illuminating. In a sense, it's like a study in like tenets and different types, the views of different systems. So Mipham's explaining, what he thinks of different schools of Buddhism, different types of Tantra, different levels of practice, and sort of arranging them with Dzogchen being the highest, both in terms of view and in practice. What I was thinking that I would do is just sort of, let's see, I think I have lost my, oh gosh, I had it open the text, but now in an effort to get set up, I seem to have gone out of there. Let's see, Beacon of Certainty. Okay. So I can't really share my screen, unfortunately, but I'm just going to go over a few passages from chapter 6 of Pettit's introduction to Beacon of Certainty. And there in chapter 6, there's a subsection where Pettit tries to, based on an earlier scholar's work, outline some of the differences between Mipham and Tsongkhapa by looking at a text by Tsongkhapa called 8 Difficult Points. And this is a text that's been translated into English a few different times. Some of the translations are easier to read than others. But it's not exactly written by Tsongkhapa. It's Tsongkhapa gave let's say, a teaching, during his lifetime, and Kedrup Jaya was taking notes on it and then wrote up those notes as a text by Tsongkhapa explaining 8 difficult points that differentiate his view of what Prasangika Madhyamaka is saying from the views of other tenet systems. And what Pettit does in this chapter, part of this chapter, is to go through those points and try to say how Mipham's view is different on some of those. So I'm not going to try to go through all the 8 difficult points, but that's the context for this discussion. So Pettit says, in Beacon, it will be seen that the differences between Mipham and Tsongkhapa on the Nitartha Nayartha distinction. That's like the distinction between what scriptures are definitive and which ones require interpretation. That they differ on that. They differ on the view. They differ on the correct way to cultivate the view in practice. And all of these differences, according to Pettit, are based on their different idea of what ultimate truth is. Tsongkhapa considers emptiness per se, emptiness itself, as an absolute negation, which is his translation for Magok, which other people translate maybe as non-affirming negative or non-implicative negation, I believe is Duckworth's translation. So an absolute negation or non-implicative negation means a negation that doesn't imply something else in the place of that which it is refuting, or no, negating is better. So, for example, when we're first learning about that, the example, which is quite strange, is the fat Devadatta does not eat during the daytime. So Devadatta, as you might know, is Buddha's cousin, and what attempted to be his rival and attempted to assassinate the Buddha and so forth during his lifetime. So he becomes, like, in this example, a fat man who never eats all day, and the implication is that he must be eating at night, right? And so that's taken as an example of an affirming negative, or Duckworth would have it as an implicative negation. He's negating the idea of him eating at any time during the day, but by saying that he's fat, the sentence is also implying that he's eating at night, secretively, apparently. Right. So Tsongkhapa does, in fact, say, and this is like a very strong point in the Gelugpa tradition, that the ultimate reality is a sheer negation, or I guess is a good way to put it, or the mere absence of inherent existence, not implying anything positive in its absence. Okay, and a lot of the other non-Gelugpa Tibetan scholars, Koramba, for example, as well as Mipham, dislike this way of understanding what the ultimate reality is. It's not that they disbelieve in emptiness. It's not that they disagree with the refutation of inherent existence. They actually agree with that, and in fact use exactly the same arguments that you find in Tsongkhapa's text, which are all derived from Indian texts, to make the argument that there is no inherent existence anywhere. But they say that to say that this mere absence, this sheer negation of inherent existence, is the ultimate truth is wrong, or sometimes they say it's a nihilistic view. Because it's taking something that feels to them like nothingness, that is a sheer negation, as being the ultimate reality. It is interesting if you step back from having a Gelugpa point of view and think about it a little bit and say, oh, here's a religious tradition that says that the ultimate truth, the ultimate nature of reality, is a sheer negation that doesn't imply anything positive in its absence. When you put it like that, you can see why people would sort of have concern that that was not a strong basis for religious practice, right? And I think that that this kind of concern also existed in India. And it's one of the reasons that, Prasangika teachings of Chandrakirti were not evidence suggests that they were not super popular in India. There's only one Indian commentary on Chandrakirti, whereas when you look at the other Madhyamaka teachers and the various Yogacara teachers, the other Mahayana Pandits in India, there are many more commentaries, and there seems to be a lot more exploration of their view. So I think I and some other people have taken this to imply that the Prasangika Madhyamaka view that came to be understood in the 11th century in Tibet as the highest view, and which Tsongkhapa took as the basis of his system, was a little bit on the margins of Indian Mahayana practice, because it didn't provide, what's the right way to put it? It didn't provide a convincing foundation or a positive basis for practice. Now, you can have a positive basis for practice without going so far as to say, fundamentally, we're all Buddhists from the very beginning, which is what, you find in Nyingma and some Kagyupa schools as well. But to say that the ultimate truth is a sheer negation that doesn't imply anything positive in its absence is, I would say, in the realm of things religious, Buddhist or not, it's pretty far in, it's pretty unusual, right, to say that. So anyway, of course, Mipham objects to this, and he says instead that the ultimate reality, the definitive view, is coalescence. Coalescence is translated by Duckworth as unity. Coalescence may be a nicer translation, I'm not sure. It's like a non-dual, you can say fusion, but that implies it's two different things, right? The non-duality of ultimate wisdom and emptiness, form and emptiness, or ultimate truth and conventional truth. However you want to take it, it's not like that the ultimate reality is one-sided on the side of emptiness, right? The ultimate reality is I'm just going to say synthesis for lack of a better word. They're using coalescence or unity, a non-duality of ultimate wisdom and emptiness. So that is what Pettit takes as sort of a starting point for their many other differences. Pettit goes on to say that Mipham tends to emphasize that the ultimate truth and conventional truth are equal and are, in a sense, they're only differentiated from the point of view of delusion. And so in actuality, everything is both, right? And this both is coalescence. It's the ultimate reality and the conventional reality of things is always right there together. Duckworth calls it two sides of one coin, just to help us understand. But of course, the idea is that they're much closer than two sides of one coin. They're you want to say they're exactly the same thing looked at from a different point of view. But I think in Tsongkhapa's writing, he would basically say exactly the same thing. That he doesn't say, that Tsongkhapa actually says, for every phenomena, there are two natures, right? And these two natures are a single entity in every place and every time, right? And we talk about them, we conceive them, we conceptualize them as different. And there's different kinds of consciousness that get at these different natures or aspects of what is, right? And when what is could be anything, right, at all, right? So I don't know if you follow what I'm saying, but I feel like that in a way, I feel like Tsongkhapa, and this is just my point of view, that Tsongkhapa and Mipham are basically saying the same thing. But Pettit doesn't take it like that. He says Mipham emphasizes the equal importance of the two truths, whereas Tsongkhapa, as advised by his deity Manju Shri, with whom he consulted, Tsongkhapa was advised by Manju Shri to emphasize proper understanding of the conventional truth, or Pettit calls it the relative truth. Well, this is a difference. Tsongkhapa was advised on the one hand by Manjushri to rely upon Chandrakirti, but he was also advised by Manjushri to be careful not to deprecate conventional realities, right? And this is how these two kinds of advice rely upon the person who appears to have the most extreme negation of that as ultimate reality, such that that person could not really become the most popular Indian Mahayana Buddhist philosopher because some people thought he was too negative. Yeah, rely on that person, but at the same time, be sure that you value conventionalities and protect them. So Tsongkhapa's, enlightenment, let's say, his inspiration, his awakening experience that led to his mature writings that, all took place in the first 2 decades of the 15th century. That breakthrough came through the, let's say, coalescence of these two pieces of advice, that to rely upon the thoroughgoing negation of inherent existence by Chandrakirti, but at the same time do that in a way that did not deprecate conventional existence. So that's the way I would understand it. Pettit, presenting this more from Mipham's point of view, he's essentially arguing that Tsongkhapa reifies conventional truths, takes them as more real than he ought to. And that is, in fact, sort of a key. That's like, I was thinking, well, what do I really want to say tonight? And I think in terms of the difference between the two, this is the thing that's really clear and important and worthwhile. So Mipham thinks that there are two different kinds of conventional truth and two different kinds of ultimate truth. And there's the conventional truth of people who have a restricted view of things, right? And that's us. So in that sense, the table that my laptop's sitting on here is a conventional truth. But it's not a conventional truth as seen from the point of view of, advanced bodhisattvas or Buddhas, right? In fact, table, as seen from the point of view of a truly advanced, wise mind, table isn't merely empty of inherent existent table. Table is empty of table. Why is table empty of table? Table's empty of table because table is actually the mandala of the Buddha. And we only see it as this coarse appearance here because of our delusion, right? So Mipham understands everything that Tsongkhapa says about reliable cognition and the importance of reasoning. And he echoes a lot of that in his text, including in Beacon of Certainty, right? But at the same time, he doesn't think that the ultimate truth as it's understood through reason is the actual ultimate truth. It's a conformative, or what do you say, a rough approximation or an abstract conceptualization of the ultimate truth, which itself cannot be conceptualized at all, right? And in the light of that kind of ultimate truth, right, then tables and chairs, as you know, we see them, all these phenomena that are appearing around us now, they actually don't exist. Now you could say, does that mean that he says, you know, all of these things are utterly non-existent? Well, he says they're conventional truths from the point of view of dummies like us. And so, you know, you could say that that's a kind of fundamental important difference between Tsongkhapa. Do these ordinary everyday phenomena we interact with have any existence, right? Tsongkhapa interprets when Nagarjuna says, you know, everything is empty, and because everything is empty, that's why it works. That things work only because they're empty. That's what allows them to function. Nagarjuna says that, you know, in the 24th chapter of the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas. And Tsongkhapa comments on that, and he says, by what works, he means what exists. And so, you know, that's his interpretation of what works, what works means. And Mipham, you know, and probably Karamba and so forth would disagree. They would say, yeah, something's practically functioning at the conventional level. That say that something conventionally exists doesn't mean that it really exists, right? It means that it's a truth for idiots. And yeah, the word that I usually translate it, and most people often say relative truth or conventional truth. The etymology of this suggests the idea of it not being a truth. In fact, yeah, Tsongkhapa emphasized that, you know, when you say, what are the two truths, two types of, the answer is not truth, because the conventional truth is not a truth. Why? Because no conventional truths exist the way they appear, right? So Tsongkhapa, you know, agrees with that and says the same thing. But the fact that they don't exist the way they appear doesn't mean they don't exist at all, right? But, you know, the real etymology of what we're translating as conventional truth, Gunzot Demba in Tibetan, the Samvriti Satya in Sanskrit, is truth for a deceiving mind, or truth from the point of view delusion. Geshe Pelden Takpa was one of my teachers, told me colorfully, I guess, that, you know, to say that when you say that conventional truth, you're saying, like, he compared it to saying shit smells good to a dog, which is in other words, like, yeah, okay. So the implication is it doesn't really smell good, right? But like for a dog, then, so we're the dog in this example, and, you know, we're taking these things as truths, right? But that doesn't mean that they're really truths. So Tsongkhapa agrees that they're not really truths, and that is what the etymology says. But he thinks that even though they're not truths, that doesn't mean they don't exist, right? Yeah, they exist, they function. Yeah. So Tsongkhapa is taking the conventional level as, in fact, the only level there is in some sense, right? In Tsongkhapa, since nothing exists ultimately, nothing exists inherently, the implication is that anything exists must exist in a merely conventional way. Well, that way of saying that, you know, being merely conventionally existent is what it is to be existent. That is not the way Mipham or Karamba or many other non-Gelugpa teachers take it at all. There are passages in Chandrakirti that Rendawa and, Tsongkhapa's teacher Rendawa and Tsongkhapa himself read and were influenced by in Tsongkhapa's early work, which seems to suggest that that conventionalities are concessions that are made by awakened beings to overcome the fearfulness and coax idiots like us along on the path. And it's not, that they have any legitimacy of their own, or their devices. And when you take it in that way, you're not conceding to them as having any existence of their own, except as a concession to fearful beings like ourselves. Yeah. So Tsongkhapa originally said things, actually, in his book, The Golden Rosary. He said things that were influenced by passages in Chandrakirti that seemed to imply that. And then that was before he had his conversations with Manjushri and figured out other ways to read Chandrakirti. Okay, so that's one kind of difference. Another difference that I talked about last time is about Tantra. Tsongkhapa, insists that emptiness is the ultimate reality, and therefore there isn't any more ultimate or ultra ultimate view in Tantra, and that the view in all of the Tantras that is the same view that is expounded by Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, the emptiness of the Madhyamaka school. And this is not the way Mipham looks at it at all. And I would say there are many other non-Gelugpas who would also disagree with that. So Tsongkhapa's view, of course, is that the difference between Sutra and Tantra is not emptiness and then there's some super emptiness in Tantra. No, it's the same emptiness. The difference is in terms of skillful means, or the techniques, or the distinction in Tantra of how one is using or actualizing one's awakening potential, right? The techniques that one's using. And, Tsongkhapa in particular stresses the idea of deity yoga in his great exposition of Secret Mantra, that the taking the form of the teacher, that is deity yoga, is what's distinct about Tantra. But Mipham, on the other hand, he doesn't exactly directly address the view, but as Pettit points out, he says that Mipham criticizes other Nyingmapas who follow Tsongkhapa and say that the different levels of Tantra are differentiated by skillful techniques alone. And he instead maintains that the degree of the subtlety of the mind, or the subjective consciousness that perceives emptiness, is crucial for differentiating the views of the different systems, starting with non-Mahayana systems and running up through all the Mahayana Sutra-based systems, and then on up through various Vajrayana systems, culminating in the Great Perfection, or Dzogchen. So just to give a slight gloss on this means that if the ultimate truth for Mipham is not the object realized on the path of seeing, it's not the object that the mind is meditating on, it's the non-duality of awakened mind and emptiness, right? This trans-conceptual, non-dualistic experience of emptiness, I guess you could say. So it's not just the experience or just the emptiness, it's the non-duality of the experience and emptiness, right? And so you can see that, first of all, that's not the kind of sheer negation that Tsongkhapa was talking about, because it's bringing in the positive side of having the mind, the non-dual mind there as well. And then also the point that Pettit's making here is because the subjectivity is part of what constitutes an ultimate truth in different systems as he understands them, then as the subjectivity becomes refined, the understanding of what ultimate truth means, even though emptiness, is emptiness, but the mind that is engaging with it becomes progressively more and more subtle until ultimately you can't really conceptualize it at all, because it transcends any kind of discursive discourse. So this is the the other point, another point that important point that Tsongkhapa disagrees with Mipham on, or vice versa, and that is this idea that Tsongkhapa's that, and he quotes sutra to support his view, that the thing that we're trying to understand when we learn about emptiness and reason about how things could possibly be inherently existent and so forth, that emptiness that we come to understand, to conceptualize, to gain, insight into, that's the same thing that one realizes on the path of seeing. And it's true that the subjective quality is completely different, because the mind is non-dual with its object in terms of its subjective experience. But when we're standing outside, not having that non-dual experience, and we describe from a dualistic point of view what's going on when somebody, has a yogic realization of emptiness, from our point of view, it's clear that, we can differentiate an object and a subject. And on the object side, there's the ultimate truth, which is emptiness, which is the same emptiness that we were learning about and conceptualizing earlier. But now it's no longer conceptualized, it's directly perceived. That's the way Tsongkhapa understands it. Yeah. And Mipham is like, it doesn't, from his point of view, it just doesn't make any sense that some set of abstract conceptualizations, dualistic thoughts. Who cares about, of course they're profound dualistic thoughts, but nonetheless, they're dualistic thoughts. The Buddha doesn't have like a dualistic perspective. The mind that eradicates the root of cyclic existence, this nirvana consciousness of the yogi. It doesn't have anything about it that seems to be like an idea, right? And in fact, that's often, how, if they talk about this, it's transconceptual. So this is an area where I feel like sometimes, well, first of all, I feel like that from my point of view, that sometimes these different traditions, Nyingma and Gelugpa, on this point are just talking past each other, because they both perfectly well agree that to become liberated, you don't have to just think about emptiness. You have to have a non-dual realization of it, right? But then is the emptiness you're having a non-dual realization of the same emptiness you were thinking about, or is it cannot be categorized in that way, right? And that's actually the language that Duckworth chooses to use to try to talk about as the categorized ultimate and the uncategorizable ultimate, right? Emptiness of inherent existence is the categorized ultimate, and we can understand it, reason our way into it, have a concept about it, and it lays the groundwork. It's just as Gelugpas would also say, right? But it lays the groundwork for an experience which doesn't seem, from Mipham's point of view, to map back on to any kind of concept that we've ever had before. I guess that's the best I can say about it. I'm going to skip forward a little bit in this book. So we talked about how Mipham is, Duckworth is a little hesitant on the point of whether to call Mipham a member of the Rime or ecumenical or non-sectarian movement or not, right? As alluded to in Eastern Tibet in the 19th century, there were many non-Gelugpas who were engaging with one another and influencing one another, reading one another's books, and that it was creating an intellectual ferment, you could say, that there were, smart young men, like, let's be clear, this is not inclusive. Smart young men were, instead of going to the Gelugpa monastery and automatically taking that as the standard for doing Buddhist philosophy, there was some lively interaction between the Sakya and Kagyapa and Nyingma schools that was, generating a lot of intellectual energy. And, Mipham's teachers were, I think, clearly identified with this movement. And from my point of view, I tend to also think of Mipham as being part of the movement because of the depth of his understanding of what Tsongkhapa was saying. But it's true that he has a very distinctive point of view and thinks that Tsongkhapa is wrong about a number of things, right? And he doesn't try to say that we're all saying the same thing in different words. He doesn't try to say that, right? He tries to outline the differences. And the way this works is a way that you do see in the Buddhist world generally. And that is to say, I started out 3 weeks ago, right, with the idea that the Buddha is a perfect doctor, and the perfect doctor doesn't prescribe the same medicine to everyone. And if you understand that, then just because you have a medicine that's really working well for you, you don't necessarily think that all your friends and neighbors should also take that medicine. Everybody has a different situation, and hopefully, skillful physician is prescribing different, and equally appropriate courses of therapy to each of them, right? So if you think of that, then of course there's, an obvious way for Buddhists to be tolerant of one another, right? By thinking, yeah, you guys have something important that's, congruent with what the Buddha taught and will help you along the path. And it's true that it's not ultimately the correct and final view that Buddha taught, but that's okay because for this lifetime and the next one, maybe several others after that, it's important for you to try to understand emptiness and meditate on permanence and practice kindness and try to be a kinder person and have a good rebirth and so forth like that. And all of these things can be achieved through, other Buddhist systems. They don't have to be through mine, which of course, mine, of course, is the best. And when you get far enough along the path, you'll realize that, and then you can, join in with my way of practicing Dharma. I mean, basically, almost all, they're not all, I'm not going to say all, I know it's not all, but almost all Buddhist groups say that about other Buddhist groups around the world, right? There's always exceptions. And the difficulty that that the Gelugpa order had in tolerating the Jonangpa teachings of Dolpapa is an example where Tsongkhapa and others see the teaching of other emptiness, that there's an absolute Buddha that's self-existent and everything is empty in the sense that it's empty of that one true reality. They see that as being, not one of the Buddha's medicines, but maybe more like a Buddhist version of Vedanta or something like that. And they're quite clear in saying this is out beyond the pale of any of the Buddhist teachings. Or you could, from another context, you could say Nichiren Buddhism in Japan and its Soka Gakkai, modern descendant, are infamously intolerant of other teachings. But they're notable for being outliers in that regard, right? And pretty much the general approach is, as I've described, thinking about these as different medicines. So, I said all that by way of leading up to saying that Mipham read not only Tsongkhapa, but also Karamba, who was a Sakyapa who wrote in the century after Tsongkhapa and criticized Tsongkhapa and provided a basis for many subsequent Kagyapa teachings as well. And Karamba has, talking about Tsongkhapa, he says, some others say that the great beings who expounded Svatantrika and the greatest of learned and accomplished ones in Tibet did not understand the important points of Madhyamaka. They try to denigrate them in all respects. They apprehend ultimate reality as the extreme of annihilation, and they denigrate freedom from the four extremes of elaboration. The essence of the teachings found in the good texts of Nagarjuna, they deprecate as the view of Hashang. The conformative ultimate arrived at through logical analysis, they claim to be the definitive ultimate reality. To eliminate all clinging to dualistic perception, they say, is an erroneous concept. So abandon this approach. So this is Karamba's caricature, I would say, or unfair redescription of what Tsongkhapa's view is. Yeah. But important point from that is that this idea that the ultimate is not a concept that you arrive at or can understand through ultimate analysis is shared with Mipham. And Mipham is, how would I say, I want to claim that he's influenced by this. And also the way that Karamba describes, the words that he uses to describe, okay, if the ultimate isn't the sheer negation of inherent existence, what is it? And he says, as he says right here, freedom from the four extremes of elaboration. So nishprapancha in Sanskrit, churdrel in Tibetan, it means like being separated from all conceptual elaborations, something like that. Free of all dualistic thought, free of all conceptualization, and then so you can have a concept of things being existent or a concept of things being non-existent. Which of those is right? They're both ultimately not right, right? And this is, of course, if you read the Heart Sutra, for example, let alone Nagarjuna, you can see that it's like, yeah, it's like the Bodhisattva has no attainment. The Heart Sutra says that. And also the Bodhisattva has no non-attainment, right? Because in emptiness, it's not just that there's no inherently existent attainment, there's no inherently existent non-attainment either, right? So that's a way of talking. It comes right out of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. You can find it all, not just in the Heart Sutra, but shot throughout the Diamond Sutra, for example, is all more or less written like this. So this is what Karma means, is that there's this freedom from all dualistic extremes, and that when you say, you know, the ultimate reality is this understanding of emptiness as a sheer negation, you're denigrating or deprecating the actual ultimate, which is this freedom from all elaborations. Now, how does Tsongkhapa, you know, Tsongkhapa wasn't around. He wasn't alive when Karmapa was writing this stuff. But, you know, he, from taking Tsongkhapa's point of view about this, he would say, you know, just the same thing he would say to Mipham. It's like, of course, there is a direct yogic perception that is utterly non-dual, that transcends all conceptual elaboration. And, you know, from the point of view of this profound experience, there's neither existence nor non-existence, because there isn't anything at all to be grasped onto, right? And then Tsongkhapa would turn around and say, yes, but when we, who are not having that non-dualist experience, stand out here and try to talk about what's going on in that non-dualistic experience, it only makes sense for us to say that, yeah, it's a realization that nothing, including existence and non-existence, has any existence in and of itself, that everything is devoid of any self-existence. Yeah. I guess that's my take on how Tsongkhapa would answer that. And Tsongkhapa does talk about this a little bit. He says, you know, everything, to exist conventionally is to exist. To exist means to exist conventionally for Tsongkhapa, not for Mipham, not for Karmapa, but for Tsongkhapa. These two things have the same meaning. So to exist conventionally means, you know, involves or requires minimally being apprehended by a conventional mind, not necessarily conceptual mind, because we have direct perception as well. But yeah, a conventional consciousness, right? So how do we know that emptiness exists, right? Well, you know, Tsongkhapa would say the final, you know, confirmation of the existence of emptiness does not come from a yogic, direct, non-dualistic realization of emptiness, because that mind doesn't have a concept of anything, including emptiness, as existing or not existing. So where does it come about that emptiness is posited as existing, that is existing conventionally? It comes from the conventional mind that arises after you emerge from the non-dualistic realization of emptiness, and looks back from a dualistic point of view on what one just went through and said, oh, I realized emptiness. Therefore, emptiness exists, right? And Tsongkhapa wants to take that seriously. Do you see what I'm saying? He wants to take that as having a kind of equal legitimacy in the way I would describe it. You know, that the conventional truth doesn't cancel out the ultimate truth, and the ultimate truth doesn't cancel out the conventional truth. We have certain kinds of consciousness that get at ultimate reality, hopefully. And in the meantime, we have other consciousness that get at conventional reality, and neither one of them cancels out or supersedes the other. But that's not what Mipham or Karmapa think, right? Mipham in particular, and we're talking mainly about, thinks that, you know, we can talk about conventional and ultimate truth at our level, and call the ultimate truth emptiness and the conventional truth tables and chairs. But really, all of these ideas and all of these supposed objects are appearing only from the point of view of and on the basis of delusion. And that as we become, we realize, as our minds become purified, and we realize that from the very beginning, we've always been Buddhas, and this has always been the Pure Land, right? Then we see that the idea that there was a pot here on a table, right, was always flawed, and that the supposed pot, which a kind of localized, temporary, provisional, conventional mind took as solidly real, was actually based on a delusion that, and transcending that delusion, you see everything as the Pure Land, or everything as the mandala, something like that. Yeah.
That's always been my curiosity.
I'm gonna maybe this is a good time for me to stop talking. Let's see. Somebody else is talking. Who is it?
So I was.
Oh, Cindy. No, it's not Cindy, because Hershey's muted.
Oh, I didn't raise mine.
Yeah, you can.
B is talking.
B is talking. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, B.
How do they establish conventionality?
Well,
or supposedly the exalted mind, or the Buddha's mind.
Oh, wait a minute. How do they establish conventionality for the Buddha's mind?
Yeah. They disagree with Tsongkhapa saying that this is conventionality and this is emptiness. So if there's no that division, how do they establish conventionality? Because obviously emptiness is not a thing by itself. It's always emptiness of something.
Yeah. Yeah. So they believe that things exist and that we can talk about things relative to different points of view. Okay. So Tsongkhapa agrees. Like, for example, the story about that comes out of the Yogacara tradition about when gods, ghosts, and humans go down to the river, and the humans are seeing it. There's some water in the river, and the gods see that's nectar, and the hungry ghosts, the pretas, see, oh, that's a river of pus and blood. And the Yogacara people are using that to try to prove that there is no external object, actually, that these objects are all arising as one entity with the mind. Well, later, of course, in the Prasangika tradition, this is not understood, that there are no external objects, but it's that there are no objects that exist independently of a certain point of view. Now, that is something that Mipham agrees with. He would say, relative to your localized delusion-based point of view that we have, thinking of ourselves, understanding ourselves, knowing ourselves as sentient beings, trying to practice the path, you can say that the table is a conventional truth and emptiness is the ultimate truth, right? But as you become awakened, you realize you adopt a different kind of perspective, a higher kind of perspective that, from Mipham's point of view, does indeed supersede the pot versus emptiness point of view. And in this higher point of view, there's the coalescence of wisdom, the non-dual, indivisible union of wisdom and emptiness, and the appearance of the Pure Land. And this is conventional and ultimate truth. All right. So there's the conventional and ultimate truth as it's taken by people like us. And when Mipham explains that, I think I made it clear. When Mipham explains that, he explains it very much the way Tsongkhapa does. He goes through and he talks about valley cognition and the importance of reason and so forth. But then, it turns out that he's framing that within a bigger framework. Whereas, okay, yeah, you have to understand all this and you just have to do this stuff because this is where we're starting out, but it's not where we're going, right? It's just clearing the ground for you to realize these transconceptual reality.
No, what I mean,
No?
when they talk, it sounds like the exalted mind or the omniscient mind sees only emptiness
Yeah,
and sees no phenomena which is empty.
yeah,
So, but that is clearly not the case because they do talk about the Pure Land. Pure Land is a phenomena relative to the Buddha's mind.
yeah. No, it's true. That's right. That's right. So it's always a challenge, both in Nyingma, in my opinion, and in Gelugpa, in my opinion. When you start trying to talk about how different things appear and exist from the point of view of an omniscient mind, just my point of view, you always run into problems. You always run into
Now,
great.
obviously, because omniscient mind is so omniscient, it's hard for us to imagine what it would see. But through inference, theoretically, there is certain, I suppose, something that I can imagine.
Right.
It occurred to me one time that we are always talking about trying to achieve this ultimate truth. But really, what we are trying to achieve is to transform our conventionality from a samsaric conventionality to a Pure Land conventionality. And we do that through the antidote of emptiness.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. I think that's true. I think that way of putting it would apply to Mipham mostly, with the exception of that you're sort of defining the ultimate truth as emptiness. And for him, he would say, well, realizing emptiness is crucial, but if you're realizing it conceptually, you're not really realizing the ultimate truth, and therefore you haven't really attained the antidote that will, allow your mind to see things as they always actually have been, which is the Pure Land.
So maybe the key here is to keep in mind what they say ultimate truth is being directly realized. It is the union of the appearance on an emptiness. So within the ultimate truth, there is the phenomena that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But the point about ultimate truth is that, from the Nyingma point of view, is that I'm trying to figure out how to say it. It's like when we stand back and say, oh, we're going to divide up your ultimate truth and talk about the subjective aspect and the objective aspect. That's exactly the opposite of what they're trying to do. The whole idea that you can divide it up into the subjective aspect and the objective aspect is a product of delusion. It's not how things actually are. Yeah. Okay, let's let somebody. I see Suvansh Kapoor has had his hand up.
Guy, thank you. Thank you for coming and teaching. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Well, I just want to share some things that resonate with what you've mentioned, based on some teachings that I've taken at Nyingma centers, okay? The first is a text by Longchenpa called Finding Rest in the Nature of the Mind. It's the chapter on the three natures, and here specifically the dependent nature. The dependent nature gets divided up has two aspects, the impure and the pure dependent. And the pure dependent nature, so you said, well, the table is not just empty of inherent existence, it is the mandala of the Buddha, right? And so here, Longchenpa says in this text that is translated by the Padmakara translation group, he says, the pure dependent nature, on the other hand, refers to the pure fields and all that appears within the sphere of the pure vision of the Buddhas. The Buddha fields, the seven precious things, luminous, unfathomable palaces, and so on.
Right.
That's the pure dependent nature. And we're not even talking about the ultimate nature. We're just talking about pure dependent nature.
Exactly. Right. No, that's why you're right. And I think that is, I think that aligns with how I've been trying to explain.
Yeah.
And the idea is that, you know, we in Gelugpa, we say that the table is empty of inherently existence, and therefore it doesn't exist as it appears. And like, how would we see it if it did exist as it appears, right? And well, you maybe see it as like an illusory table, or a table that appears but doesn't have any objective. You know, one time I heard a Geshe say, well, it's like watching a movie or watching an image on TV, and you can see that there's an appearance there, but you don't for a second think that that thing has any actuality from its own side. So, you know, maybe we could reach a level where we understand tables, and at the same time, that understanding of tables that exist is conditioned by our simultaneous awareness that they have no existence in and of themselves. That would be, I'm conjuring up a Gelugpa way of explaining it. But as you point out, you know, in Longchenpa or Rongsom or Mipham, they're not going to say that. They're going to say that the table's emptiness of inherent existence is not the ultimate truth. It's just the ultimate truth from the point of view of Tsurtong. That means people who have a constricted or restricted scope of vision, right? And that means us, clouded by delusion. So the ultimate, you know, when you say, you know, when you talk about the table being empty, what Mipham wants to say is the table is empty of table. He says that in Beacon of Truth. He doesn't use the table, he uses a pot. And he says it's wrong to say that a table is empty of inherent existence, because that's actually a form of other emptiness. And the Gelugpas are all criticizing the Jonang other emptiness, but in fact, they're saying, you know, a pot is empty of something other than the pot, something that doesn't exist at all, this thing called inherent existence. And what they, you know, are failing to understand is a pot is actually, it's empty of pot, right? And it's empty of pot in the sense that all of this is the mandala of the Buddha from the beginning. Always
Right.
has. Yeah.
Right. So that's one point that you made. I think the other one also, you know, that you made is this idea that it's hard to talk about things to reason, right? It's hard to reason and put together, you know, dissimilar, incongruent views. Okay, and I received this teaching on Lion of Speech, which is which is Mipham's writing on Buddha nature, very recently, about a month or so ago. And the Nyingmapa teacher said, he said, look, some of these things don't make sense to us reasoning about Buddha nature. Okay, and this is a paragraph on page 156 of Lion of Speech, again translated by the Padmakara translation group, where Mipham says it's not easy to reason. Okay, and he says that this is not the same as it's because from the viewpoint of non-duality, you know, where the knower and the things known are of a single taste. Okay, from that viewpoint, talking about from that viewpoint, some of these things that is seen are not the same. You know, we may think it doesn't make sense, but it's because he's speaking from a non-dual perspective.
Right.
So, I mean, what we were told is that even bodhisattvas on the path, okay, don't necessarily see some of this, okay, and it takes a fair amount of progress on the path to really see how these things can come together.
Yeah, I agree that characterizes the point of view I've been trying to articulate. I'm going to just briefly respond to it from a Gelugpa point of view, which is that you can't talk about things from a non-dualistic perspective. You can make gestures, you can point, but as soon as you start talking, you're using words. If you're talking and you're making words, you're making sounds, people understand a certain meaning associated. You're already in the realm of dualism, which implies that, all of Mipham's teachings about things are always of one taste, that's in the realm of dualism. You can't, we exist in this, whenever we're talking about the Dharma or writing about the Dharma, right? We're existing in the space of duality. And I think that what's good about Gelugpa is that they take that seriously and they figure out, how are we going to work with this duality, right? And sometimes, like Longtrip is a good example more than Mipham. It's a little frustrating to me when you read things that conjure up and evoke the sphere of non-duality. But of course, they have to do it with words and language, which are inevitably dualistic, right? But you can see that it's a religious point of view to try to use words to point beyond words. The first line of the Tao Te Ching, the most important single teaching in Taoism, is that the Tao that can be talked about is not the real Tao. I think that applies to Buddhahood as well. Okay, Abelardo.
Hi, Guy. Here I am. So glad to see you again. Last year, you and I had a one-on-one meeting. I've gotten so much out of this course with you. And I want to address a slightly different type of question. I'm very interested about the implications of Mipham's thought, the practical implications today, both in the East-West dialogue about Buddhism, which it's really a deep divide there between secularism and traditional Tibetan Buddhism, right? So that on the one hand, and on a practical level, also, I think what's really needed is how can we learn to live in both dimensions simultaneously, both states of mind. It's all conventional, and I think that what's unique about Buddhist thought and phenomenology, it's that it's simultaneously a phenomenological approach and it's a functional approach. And so the criteria of validity of knowledge is therefore a twofold nature. What is true, what is valid, but also what is useful, depending on one's values or whatever goals are, or what the culture is defining for us. In that context, my specific question goes is to where did the origin of these dualisms began? Because in some interpretations of Nyingma tradition and of the Tibetan yoga, and there's a continuity from the pre-Buddhist period of Patanjali yoga and other systems that it was clearly reflecting then in when Buddhist thought developed. You have two clear different lines of transmission of knowledge. You have the monastic system, and then you have for the lay people, married people, and for them tantric sex and illumination is natural, right? So I think in our time today we have that split still, you know. So it's like I've done a lot of studying in the Gelugpa tradition, and there's something I felt uncomfortable about. I could not really pinpoint it, but until, you know, it's coming much clearer now, thanks to this class. You know, we in the West, we're hedonic people, and so we have to accept that reality. But how can we transcend that materialistic hedonism that creates self-destruction for all of us in the planet, and simultaneously, though, live ethically in this world, but fully live in this world, so. To me, that's a very fundamental duality that maybe this paradigm can help us solve. What do you think?
I'll tell you what the most important thought I think that came to mind while you were talking, especially there towards the end, when you're talking about hedonic starting point and so forth, is Lama Yeshe's teachings. And like I've taught many times his book Introduction to Tantra to my, you know, undergraduate students, and it's a beautiful book, and it talks about, you know, the origins of the Kala Chakra teachings, and it talks about how that, you know, Tantric Buddhism is never against pleasure, and that feeling good is much more Buddha-like than feeling bad. And that, you know, joy, delight, pleasure are, you know, congruent with awakening, not antithetical to it. And so then he goes on to say, the problem, of course, is how we become attached to those sensations or emotions or objects that we associate with those sensations or emotions. And then it becomes poisonous, right? So he distinguishes pleasure and joy, right? As, and of course he was a monastic, right? But as a tantric monastic, he's, you know, sort of, I think very skillfully and mostly teaching to Westerners, right? Stresses this idea that pleasure is not a bad thing. It's something that's brought into the tantric path. And Mipham, what Mipham has to say about this, and I don't know, I can't quote it from memory, but he goes through different afflictions. You know, people often say that one of the distinctions of Tantra is bringing the afflictions into the path. But you usually don't see people break it down and explain, oh, exactly how do you bring jealousy into the path, exactly, and so forth like that. And Mipham talks about that. He goes through different afflictions, and he just redescribes them in a way that, like, okay, you know, all of these afflictions are manifestations, right? Distorted manifestations of the awakened mind. And in terms of the awakened mind, this is the way they can function. Right. And he does that with desire, of course, among other afflictions. So I found that very interesting. I hadn't actually read anything like that in Gelugpa material.
Yeah.
Where is that in Mipham's writings?
You can find it in, you know, the Duckworth book. And then in the third part of the Duckworth book, there's all those translations. And one of the translations, it's about 3 or 4 pages long, is a text where he goes through, I think, 6 different afflictions. And he describes how each one, I could say, be reframed, or from a Gelugpa point of view, I would want to say could be sublimated, that the energy associated with this affliction can be, what do you say? An aspect of, you know, because fundamentally we're Buddhas right now, right? So he sees these as you know, diluted reflections of something that is actually valuable that's going on in our awakened nature.
That seems to be the one that's called Bringing afflictions onto the path.
That's the one. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, that's an interesting text because as Duckworth says in the introduction, it seems like I don't know. I'm not claiming that it's absolutely original. It's just that it's original to me. I hadn't read anything like that before.
What is the name of the
Bringing
book?
bringing afflictions into the path.
No, Duckworth's book.
Oh, it's Mipham. I don't know. His life. Mipham, his life and teaching. Something. Did somebody put it in the chat?
I'll get the link. I'll put it in
Yeah.
chat.
Yeah, we were doing that the last 3 weeks. So what can I say about comparing these two books? I think Duckworth's book is easier to read, and it also has the virtue of including, carefully chosen and well-translated excerpts from many different aspects of Mipham's writings. Pettit's book is, Douglas Duckworth is a good scholar, but this particular book he was trying to write for a broader audience. Pettit's book, therefore, is a little bit more specifically scholarly, but in some sense, it moves through the same structure that Duckworth's book is, trying to give people enough background to set up an explanation of Mipham's teachings. And then some people could argue that Duckworth has gone farther than Pettit in terms of formulating his own interpretations or explanations of what Mipham is doing, where Pettit is a little more careful to just say exactly what Mipham says rather than trying to create it as a coherent system. And then, of course, Pettit gives us, a translation of one of Mipham's most important texts, where, and also Pettit gives us the better biographical information. Pretty much all the biographical information in Duckworth can also be found in more detail with primary sources in Pettit's book as well.
Guy, does not in some way the Dzogchen resolve all of this, these dualisms that we're talking about?
Well, some people think it does.
Could you talk a bit about Mipham's approach to Dzogchen and how he integrates that, maybe, to the other?
Well, I guess I'm not. So in terms of actually talking about the practice of Dzogchen, I feel not really qualified. But the idea, as I think, maybe you have already gotten from your Nyingma teachers, is to go beyond. So you do analysis and you understand emptiness, but then the idea is to go beyond analysis and rest in a non-conceptual, non-discursive state. Now, this idea that you can realize emptiness, meditate on emptiness, understand emptiness, and then rest in a non-discursive, non-conceptual state that cannot be defined as or pinned down as being meditation on emptiness, because emptiness is a mere concept. This is one of the views that Tsongkhapa criticizes very intensely in the great treatise on the stages of the path, because he thinks that people, they understand emptiness and then they say, I'm just going to rest my mind in the basic nature of things, and then they become blank, right? And you're not actually realizing or attaining anything, or at very best, you're attaining a kind of meditative tranquility or serenity, stabilizing meditation. Dzogchen in that way it's very like, in some ways, like Soto Zen. Soto Zen teacher in Chicago at Dragon's Gate Temple, his name is skipping my mind at the second, told me, because he was thinking I would understand Soto only from a Tibetan point of view. He said, well, it's really very much like Dzogchen. Well, it's like the roots of Soto in China were described as cultivating an empty field, right? So you're not focusing your mind on a koan. You're not focusing your mind on a breath. You're not visualizing a deity's body. You're not visualizing yourself as a deity's body, right? You're clearing your mind of all dualistic distinctions, all concepts, and with a sharp kind of concentration, focusing on the openness of I want to say space, but it's not literal space, right? It's the spaciousness of a mind that's not taking any particular object. So when you read how, Cao Dong, the precursor of Soto in China, is described, it sounds a lot like Dzogchen to me. And this relates to the Hashang debate, that Hashang is taken as this sort of coming from China into Tibet as the antithesis of Tsongkhapa's reason-based approach. Now, Hashang seems to, we don't know exactly what his views were, right? Because they're represented secondhand and so forth. But he's taken by Tsongkhapa as being the symbol of the idea that just making your mind blank is better than understanding emptiness, and that making your mind blank is the path to awakening. Tsongkhapa actually uses a metaphor toward the end of the Great Treatise on the Stage of the Path to Enlightenment. He uses a metaphor that certainly must have come out of one of these texts. And he says, these people say, why throw a ball and then go and chase after it and retrieve it? Just don't throw it in the first place. So that means don't bother, elaborating concepts and then having to deconstruct them. Just don't form any concepts in the first place, right? And so that's taken as the far extreme. But I think the way that the basic nature, the vast expanse, the Dharma Dhatu, all this kind of language that you find in Longchenpa, they don't think of it as nothingness the way Tsongkhapa would characterize it, right? Yeah.
Right. They talk also about a primordial Buddha, Samantabhadra, and that
Right.
we are all Buddhas, and so we have that basic nature. But also, it reminds me very much of Vedanta, because this ground that you just mentioned, it's an ongoing creative process, and we're emanations of that, and we're always connected to that. We are that, but we're also individuals in this plane, in the desire realm, and in the desire realm, everything you perceive is either pleasurable or not, or disagreeable or neutral. So Dzogchen teaches you to see the phenomena as transitory, because you can never really pinpoint the present, right? So they talk about a fourth time. And so it's being able to live in the world, but at the same time realize that, its dynamic nature, its ultimately interconnected nature. If you approach it more from dependent origination, it's a much more positive approach that I think akin to what you were advising now.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way to think about it. It reminds me of something that Bob Thurman said one time in a radio interview with somebody who didn't understand anything about Buddhism or Tibet, and she was saying, how can living in New York City, how does anything from Tibetan Buddhism make any sense to you or help you make sense out of your world in Manhattan? And I'm guessing he lives in Manhattan. I don't know. And he said, well, it's not like, I'm worshiping some Tibetan god in the sky. It's like understanding that in some sense, everything is here, but in another sense, it isn't, right? And when you understand that things are here, but not really here in the way that they ordinarily seem, it gives you a lot more ability to work with other people and work with other situations.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think that's a Gelugpa-derived way of talking about what Trungpa was saying when he said all situations are workable. Okay, B.
I'm back. Given what Mipham's criticism of Tsongkhapa, that Tsongkhapa say pot is empty of true existence,
Yeah,
whereas Mipham say pot is empty of pot.
right.
Because pot is actually manifestation of the Buddha land.
Right.
Yeah. So given that criticism, what does Mipham consider to be the root of samsara? Or put it in another way, what is the root problem that we need to overcome in order to be able to see pot is empty of pot?
Yeah. Well, I think that sometimes when you're reading Mipham, he talks about the tendency of delusion to reify these things or take them as existing just as they appear, and by which we could interpret them as meaning what? That these things don't inherently exist in the way they appear, or it could mean, you know, taking them to exist in the coarse way that they appear to us rather than as aspects of the mandala. But then at another level or point of view, it seems like what he really thinks, and this comes up over and over again, is that the idea that there's a dualistic distinction that can operate between conventional truth, ultimate truth, or between sentient beings and Buddhas, or between, you know, any kind of dualistic distinction whatsoever, that this is the root of our problems, because we think of ourselves as that they're Buddhas that we aren't and sentient beings that we are, whereas actually, yeah, it's not like that. So, yeah, form and emptiness, you know, this is sentient beings and Buddhas. He thinks that, you know, having dualistic conceptions is, yeah, and all of that comes under the category of delusion, whether you think about it as reifying things as existing as they appear, or whether you think about it as sort of forming dualistic conceptions about things. I think he sees these as quite congruent or different ways of talking about the same thing. So, you know, you can always ask the question, like, well, if we're Buddhists from the very beginning, how did we get so deluded?
Well,
ask your name.
That's a question for another day. But on what we are discussing here now, you said Mipham talk about the Pure Land and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So obviously he thinks about like the Pure Land and how the mode of abidance of the Pure Land. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Samanta Vajra.
Because for Tsongkhapa, that is the conventional and the ultimate, the phenomena, and then the ultimate mode of abidance of a phenomena. And so, because obviously it is not just simply the mode of abidance, because the mode of abidance need a phenomena, because that's how so the two are inseparable, but they are not the same.
Exactly.
Yeah. So subject and object can be inseparable in terms of how, you know, the mind create the world and what language you want to use to describe that, but they are not the same. So sometimes when I listen to teaching like this, I can't help but get the feelings that they are conflating conventional truth and ultimate truth.
So
it's a very blasphemous
you're
to make because I'm saying that some guru is wrong. but
No,
I can't do that.
you're explaining things exactly right from a Gelugpa point of view, right? And what I was, you know, the whole exercise here is, you know, I kind of, I don't know, I don't consider myself a Gelugpa per se, but my intellectual outlook is like, I would say mainly influenced by Tsongkhapa. And so, you know, how can, from a Dalai Lama, Tsongkhapa point of view, how can we look at people like Mipham who are, you know, part of the Buddhist tradition and are, you know, living in intimate interrelationship culturally with the Gelugpa tradition, but are saying different things. And so what I've been trying to do is, you know, you're saying, well, they're confusing conventional truth and ultimate truth, and they're confusing the wisdom that realizes emptiness with emptiness. And Mipham's turning around and saying, well, these things, this idea that these things can be differentiated, they can be differentiated, but the idea that you know, that dualistic distinction is the foundation, that itself is part of the problem, because the ultimate mind that realizes things does not perceive any of those dualistic distinctions at all. And so he, like, for example, the ultimate mind, let's just say with Tsongkhapa's point of view, the ultimate mind does not know that it's realizing the ultimate truth. It doesn't know itself as separate from emptiness. You say it's separate from emptiness. I say it's separate from emptiness, and it looks from its own point of view over to the object emptiness. But that's not how it experiences itself, because it's sheerly non-dualistic. Are you going to say that the mind of the ultimate mind, right, the mind of nirvana, the mind of the first moment of the path of seeing, that mind is mistaken because it falsely fails to recognize the fundamental duality of conventional and ultimate truth?
Well, when you say
You don't want to say
I'm
that.
thinking about the most ultimate mind, which is the omniscient mind.
Yeah.
And omniscient mind, we say that it is the mind in which they can see the conventional and emptiness simultaneously.
Correct.
But that does not mean that the conventional and its emptiness are the same. In fact, they are mutually exclusive.
So says Tsongkhapa.
Mutually
So
exclusive.
says Tsongkhapa. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
That's what Tsongkhapa says. You have learned your Gelugpa lessons very well. And I'm not disagreeing with you. I have written about this, you know, and I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying that's not what Mipham says. We're on a Mipham adventure.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, actually, even for Tsongkhapa, the way he posits the grounds that on path of seeing in meditative equipoise, yeah, the only thing that appears to the yogi, the bodhisattva, is this a non-affirming negation. So at that point, the bodhisattva doesn't think, oh, I'm realizing emptiness. The minute he thinks that he's no longer directly realizing emptiness. So that part is true.
Yeah. No, you got it exactly correct. Yeah. So the one way to think of you can start from that to understand Mipham's point of view if you want. So suppose instead of taking our point of view, which you just articulated about what's going on with that yogi, suppose you try to say, yeah, but how does all this look from the yogi's point of view? Instead of saying, how does the yogi look from our point of view? You can say, yeah, we have our point of view, but of course it's based in delusion. How do we look from the yogi's point of view, right? And then you have this idea that, well, there isn't any dualistic distinction between the mind and the object. There isn't any distinction that appears, right? It's the transcending of all the dualistic distinctions that Gelugpa teaches us very carefully how to make in order to make sense out of this, right? But is making sense the be all and end all of learning the Dharma? It is in Tsongkhapa's tradition. Yes, it's like, yeah, making sense of stuff is really powerful, but it's just one kind of medicine. I happen to like it. You seem to like it quite a lot, but there's other ways to point at reality than just trying to explain it coherently.
Yeah, if we are looking at the yogi's point, subjective experiential point of view on path of seeing, in meditative equipoise, of course, that is what appears to the yogi because the object is emptiness. At that time,
Yeah, so you say. Yeah.
I mean, that emptiness,
Yeah.
although that is the appearance and that's the experience, but in reality, that emptiness, of course, doesn't exist in the vacuum. It is emptiness of something.
Yeah. I'm proud of you, B, that you understand Tsongkhapa's point of view so well. And maybe, you know, what I'm trying to do is say, understanding it so clearly, the next thing is to not be dogmatic about it and recognize that there could be other ways of using words to point people towards awakening and kindness besides the way that Tsongkhapa does.
That is the reason I've been exploring teaching from other lineages.
Oh, good.
Try to make sense of what they are saying within their own system.
Yeah.
And I find that when I do understand it, like just now, you just pointed something that's been bugging me forever, was that what Mipham meant by pot is empty of pot.
Yeah.
Now, understanding that enrich my understanding of Tsongkhapa.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm glad you brought that up again, because one thing I wanted to say about that I didn't say, well, I think I mentioned it in one of the other classes though, is that when you say the pot is inherent existence, empty of inherent existence, which is, you know, what the Gelugpa tradition teaches, every way that you say something has pitfalls. It has strengths and weaknesses. That's my position anyway. And when you say, we want to talk about how the pot is not empty of pot, but because that would negate the conventional existence of pot, but pot is merely empty of inherent existence. Okay, so people don't know what inherent existence is. They've never heard of inherent existence. They have no sense of what you're talking about when you say inherent existence. So at a superficial level, you're making up something that no one actually knows themselves as believing in. And you're saying, oh yeah, you have this idea that, you know, Guy inherently exists, and you're adding inherent existence onto Guy like a hat on top of my head. And then you're using meditation on emptiness to knock the hat off again. This comparison that I just explained, you know, the way you can go wrong in saying we're not refuting the existence of things, we're refuting their inherent existence. That comes from a text by the 5th Dalai Lama himself. He's giving people guidance. When you're meditating on emptiness, don't make the mistake of thinking that you're refuting anything other than exactly how you have always taken these things to be. Like this is a way that I, you know, coming from a more Gelugpa point of view, would interpret pot is empty of pot. Pot is empty of the only kind of pot that I have ever known. You know, I'm always thinking about pot and relating to pot in a way that sort of assumes that it has an objective reality. It's not been merely designated by my mind, right?
Now, the one thing that you say that make it so worthwhile for me to be here today is your explanation of what Mipham meant by empty is empty of pot. Now, with that explanation, I understand that I can have a way of thinking that he is not negating the whole conventionality. So to think that actually is a misunderstanding of Mipham's view. See, and that is the kind of understanding insight I'm looking for when I read Mipham, Longchenpa, and whatever. But oftentimes people just say words as if we already know them, and they don't explain further what they meant. You know, when they say, oh, pot is empty of pot, you know? Yeah.
It's if you read Beacon of Clarity.
And that kind of confirm also what I was saying earlier on. Now, right now, we are seeing pot as this, you know, contaminated phenomena and whatever it is. And to eventually, we want to practice and transform ourselves to be able to see pot as the mandala. So we are transforming conventionality. That's what we are doing.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I understand what you're doing.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
I'm
thanks.
sorry, I got so excited.
Yeah. Thanks, B. Okay. I don't see any other hands up, and I have to say that I'm pretty tired. Oh, no, does Abelardo have his hand up?
That's me again, yes.
He just raised his hand.
Your previous dialogue was so significant. I just want to say one thing. Is it not possible that we are confusing emptiness with impermanence? That's where, because to me, to live in this world and have a Buddhist Dharma worldview of emptiness, emptiness to me connotes more interconnectedness. So in order to live in this world, we need to know how the world functions, and we need to know how each object functions. How long does it last in its apparent existence in order for it to be useful to me? That's how we live. But I don't think, and I think modern quantum physics and the dialogue it's having now with Buddhist Dharma helps a lot too, because it teaches us there are no fundamental particles, which is basic in most Buddhist tenet systems. All there is just waves, of one fundamental energy that organizes itself intelligently, and we are manifestations of that intelligence. We are speaking right now thanks to that intelligence, and it's very dynamic, and there's nothing permanent about our words. It's so that's my contribution to this dialogue. What do you think?
Yeah. Impermanence is, of course, not the same as emptiness, but it's a good starting point to understanding emptiness. It is, in a sense, a kind of emptiness, the emptiness of any permanent or unchanging object. Like when you start to, people all around the world, like, for example, Japanese Buddhist culture, for example, people don't necessarily understand emptiness, but everybody understands that Buddha teaches impermanence, and gosh darn it, it's constantly being verified by everybody's experience of living their lives. And so people see, oh yeah, there's like a truth in Buddhism because of this idea of impermanence. It's the accessible face of emptiness. It's a gateway to understanding emptiness, therefore. Like, for example, when you say impermanence means that everything's changing, things are changing. And then you say, well, what are these things that are changing? Is there a thing that's here at one time and then the same thing is here at the next time, but it's like a different thing? Then it's not really, things aren't really changing. Things are constantly turning into different things. Well, when do they turn into different things? Moment by moment? No, you can't find, just like you can't find a fundamental particle, you can't find a fundamental indivisible moment. So, right. And when you start to look for the things that are changing, and you find that you can't really say when or what they are, then you're crossing over from understanding impermanence as meaning things change, right, to understanding that there's no really graspable thing there in the way that you thought, right?
Well, that's all you need to liberate yourself from attachment.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you for inviting me, Sheila, and whoever else you're working with. I guess Snehi's out of town. Yeah.
Safe and retreat. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Guy. This has been really, really a great class.
Yeah.
Lots of food for
Thank you so
thought.
much. Really
Yeah. Good conversations. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Get some rest.
Yeah. Bye.
Okay.
Best wishes.
Thank you, everyone.